Hi guys, welcome to your final station of our Decline of Feudalism station activity. This is the station about the plague, also known as the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. So we are going to go over these documents here. Excuse me, and then you're going to use these documents to answer the question that is in Schoology. So if you look at my documents, and these documents are also linked at the bottom of the assignment for you, I've highlighted or color coded them based on particular pieces or bits of information. And so I'm going to put in the chat what the color coding means so that you can see here and remember what those colors refer to. So anything in red has to do with the plague itself. And we're considering the plague for this particular station to be a cause of the decline of feudalism. Okay, so that's our cause. And all of the other stations you've looked at have given you additional causes for why the feudal system, remember that pyramid that we talked about in Unit 1, ultimately collapsed or collapses during this time period. So what we're going to be looking at is how the plague was one of those causes of the decline of feudalism. So anything that's highlighted in red over here in the document has to do with specific details about the plague or its broader impact on Western Europe or feudal Europe during the time. Okay. Once we look at the cause, what the actual plague was and how it impacted the broader community, now we can start to look at some of the effects of that impact. And we're going to look for 3 different types of effect, which is why there are 3 other colors highlighted or color-coded in the document. So anything that's in green is going to be an economic effect of the plague on feudalism. Okay. Anything that's in blue is going to be a political effect of the plague on feudalism. And anything that's in yellow is going to be a social effect of the plague on feudalism. Okay, and the reason we're going to look at those 3 different things is because if you can, again, think back to Unit 1, the feudal system, that feudal pyramid that we talked about with the monarchs at the top and then the lords and then the knights and then the peasants, that pyramid, that system was a combination and intertwining of economics, politics, and social status, right? So the economic piece was how the goods for the manor got produced, who was doing the work to produce the food and the other items that were needed on the manor for people to survive, and then how were those goods distributed, who had the wealth, who didn't. The political piece had to do with the power structure, the monarch at the top having the most power, making the decisions for the entire kingdom, the lord under him having the second most power, making all of the day-to-day decisions for his manor, the land that he owned and all of the people that lived on it. The knights, as part of that noble class, having additional power to make decisions in terms of protection of the manor. And then finally, the peasants at the bottom, who had the least amount of power and basically had to obey all of the people above them. It also concerned who had the right to make laws, who had the right to enforce laws, all of those types of things, right? And then on top of all of that, the pyramid was also a social structure. You were born into your social class. You were either born into the peasant class, the noble class, which meant you could be a nobleman or a knight, or you were born into the royal family of the monarchy. And whatever social status you were born into, you couldn't change that. You couldn't move up and down the pyramid. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. If you were born a noble, you stayed a noble, etc., right? And wherever you were born into that pyramid, that determined your the job you could have. It determined where you lived. It determined how you lived. It determined where, if you were even able to travel off the manor, where you could travel, who you were allowed to interact with, how you interacted with them on a daily basis, all of those things that made up your day-to-day life, right? So when the plague hits Europe it causes all sorts of disruption within this pyramid. It causes problems with how all of the goods, the food and the fields and the produce and all of the other things that are being produced on the manor, how those things get produced and how they get distributed. It causes political problems because the people in power start to have problems keeping control over those who are under them. And it causes social issues or social problems because people find ways that they can break out of that social class that they were born into because of the new social realities of life after the plague. And so that's what we're going to look at today. So this first paragraph here in red tells us just a little bit about the plague itself. It tells us that between 1347 and 1352, the Black Death killed more than 20 million people in Europe, and that this was 1/3 or more of Europe's population. Okay, so the plague was this horrible disease. It came out of Asia, it swept across Europe. It affected more than just Europe. It affected the whole medieval Mediterranean world. It affected Asia. It affected the Middle East. It affected North Africa. It affected medieval Europe. We're focused on medieval Europe because of the impact that it had on the feudal system in particular, but that doesn't mean it didn't impact all of these other places in the world. And so what happens, they finally realize that this disease has to do with, it's coming from this bacteria that is being transmitted by fleas and rats that are on the trading ships that are coming out of the east, coming out of China and India, and then docking at these ports and these trading cities in Europe, and then it's spreading from there. And before they can really do anything to stop it, it has spread like wildfire across Europe. The only thing that they find that is effective to stop it is the same thing we did in 2020, quarantine. And if you think about the medieval towns of the time, it was actually much easier for them to quarantine than it even was for us within the last 11 months, right? Because they have these towns, you have your castle or your manor house, where the Lord lives, right? And then you have all of the fields and all of the land that's owned. You have the peasants' homes here on the manor and the fields that they're farming. You have your marketplace and all of your merchants. You have your church, all of that. And then it's surrounded by a wall to protect you from anyone who might attempt to attack, whether it's a neighboring kingdom or the Vikings or the barbarians, whoever it might be that you're worried about attacking you. And then within that wall, there are gates that you can close. So whole cities, whole manors, whole towns and villages would quarantine during this time. They wouldn't let anybody in. They wouldn't let anybody out. However, that realization that they could do that didn't come until already a huge number of people had already died from the disease. Okay. And we know that it was about 1/3 of the population. So for the ease of math, we're going to say we live on a manor of about 100 people, right? And the plague sweeps through and it affects our manor as well as all of the manors around us. And instead of having 100 peasants to do the work on that manor, once the plague comes through, we now only have 66, 67 peasants to do the same amount of work that 100 peasants did before. And that's going to cause a problem because we have the same amount of land that needs to be plowed, the same amount of crops that need to be harvested, the same amount of bread that needs to be baked, tools that need to be made, armor that needs to be made and given to the knights who are going off to the crusades. All of these things need to still keep happening within our manor, right? And so the Lord would go to the peasants, for example, and say, hey, here's the deal. We have all this work to do. 1/3 of the people have died, but we still need to get it done. So I know that you're used to only working 6 hours a week, but now I need you to work 7. And I know you're only used to working 8 hours a day, but now I need you to work 12. And I'm not going to pay you any more money for that. And the peasants started to realize, that's not really a good deal for me. Like this whole feudal system wasn't a great deal for me before. This really isn't a good deal for me, right? And so they start to say, no, hold up. You want more work out of us, you need to pay us more. My time is worth money. My labor is worth money. You don't have any other choice because there's nobody else you can go hire because they're all dead. You need to pay me what I want. And so that's what this first green paragraph is talking about. It's talking about how the plague, when it swept through and killed 1/3 of the population, had a huge effect on the relationship that existed between the lords who owned the land and the peasants who worked for them. Because as people died, it became harder and harder to find people to plow the fields, harvest the crops, and produce the other goods and services needed. And so the peasants started to demand higher wages. A wage is what you get paid for your time and your work, right? So now the lords are like, the peasants don't want to do this. What am I going to do, right? Well, remember, this is a political structure too, as well as an economic structure, and the lords have the powers. They say, I know, I'll just pass a law, and I'll tell them they have to work, and they have to work for the same amount of money they were working for before the plague. So that's what this blue paragraph here talks about. The European rulers tried to keep wages from rising. They tried to suppress the peasants. They tried to push them back down to the bottom of the pyramid and say, no, we're not going to give you any more money. We're not going to give you any more food or land or anything else for your time. You need to work the way we tell you need to work. And we're not going to pay you anything more, not a dime more, not an apple more, not a cow more than what you were being paid before the plague. And so that's what they put into law here. And that doesn't work out very well either, because the peasants still go, oh, I'm still not doing it, right? You need to pay me more or I'm not going to work. So then the lords go, I know, if you don't follow my law, I'm going to put you in jail. I'm going to punish you. And the peasant goes, okay. And all the peasants who refuse to work get put in jail. The Lord still has nobody to work for him. He still has nobody to plow his fields. So despite trying to put all of these political fixes in place, these laws in place to force people to work in a situation that they don't want to work in, it doesn't work out. It would be the same as if somebody came in today, a politician today said, you know what, this whole minimum wage thing, it's getting way out of hand. We need to make a law that says that anybody who's working for minimum wage, starting February 5th, 2021, the law says we can no longer pay them any more than what minimum wage was in 1995. Now, minimum wage in 1995 was $6 an hour. I know that because that was my first job. Minimum wage today in 2021 is twice that. Okay. Same sort of concept. You know, when you tell a worker that, the workers are going to say, good luck finding somebody to do the job for $6 an hour. Now, there may be one or two people out there who need that $6 an hour enough that they're going to take the job. But for the most part, the workers are going to be able to demand more. And that's what happens within the feudal system. So all of these laws they try to put into place, they don't work, right? So eventually what happens, and it tells us here, that these laws were very ineffective. They did not work. It was, you know, the lords trying to use their political power and their political pressure to push the peasants back down into that bottom rung of the feudal system economically. But eventually, what happens is wages do increase because there are fewer workers and labor had become more scarce. There's still the same amount of work that needs to be done. There's less people to do it. Ultimately, if you want the work done, you're going to have to pay more for that labor because it's in such high demand. Because if I'm peasant number one and you want me to plow your field and I don't like what you're offering to pay me, after the plague, I can go to Lord number 2 or Lord number 3 or Lord number 4 and say, you know what, this guy's only offering me this much money to plow his field. I'll do it for you for this much. And I'm probably going to get hired because that Lord needs my work just as much as Lord number 1 did, who didn't want to pay me for it, right? Whereas before the plague, if I said no, the Lord would say, see you later. And he would go find peasant number 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 150 because there were countless peasants who needed the land, the food, the shelter, the protection. All right. So that's the economic change and that's the political change. And then it starts to change socially too, because once this pyramid, once they no longer have the political control from the top and once they no longer have the economic control from the top, keeping people at these lower wage jobs and under their political control, people start to realize that that social hierarchy can start to flex and change too. And so what happens is the lords realize they do not have the same control over the workers that they used to have. And the workers start to realize, you know what, these lords, they can't tell me what to do anymore. I can make choices now for myself that under the feudal system, I couldn't make. I can now choose where I want to live, where I want to work, who I want to work for, what type of work I want to do, and how much money I'm willing to accept for my work. And so what we start to get is the beginning of a capitalist market where people offer their work and their services to whoever is willing to pay them what they feel is a fair wage, rather than a feudal system that forces people into that manual labor simply because they were born into that level of society. Okay, so if you want to take a look at the actual law that they tried to put into place to keep people in that feudal system, to keep people down in that peasant class, you can take a look at it. It was called the Statute of Laborers, 1351. This was in England. There were similar laws in other European countries. None of them worked. So this just kind of gives you an example of what one of those laws would look like. And again, it's color coded. It tells you, you know, this is the cause because a great part of the people, the population has now died. The economic effect of that is the scarcity of servants who are not willing to serve or work unless they receive excessive wages, more than what the lords wanted to offer them. And so then this blue part is the actual text of the law that they tried to put in place to keep them in that feudal pyramid longer than they wanted to be kept. So what you need to do is in Schoology, there is a question you need to answer based on what we just talked about here. You can go back and look at the documents again. Make sure you answer the question in complete sentences and submit it in Schoology for me. Hope you have a great day. Bye.